focus on the on the capital part. Last is what is you want to use a differentiator. So why will this industry be able to compete with an industry already say in Southeast Asia? So is it basis sustainability? Is it basis cost? What is going to be the key differentiator? So I think for us, for an industry zone or for our ecosystem to be successful, these are some of the key things that we look at.
Thank you very much. And you've raised some important points there when we think of soft infrastructure, hard infrastructure, as well as innovative financing and capital raising structures. And that brings me to my next question, Mr. Sameh. When it comes to the AFC, one of the things that we did here today was Finnovation. I'd like to get a little bit more insights in terms of what are the strategic industries of focus and how do you see Finnovation taking place?
Thank you very much. I'd like to take the example of transition metals. And the way we think about it is very simple, demand and supply. What drives demand is, in the case of transition metals, is the drive to climate change, the drive for EV vehicles. What also drives demand is geopolitics. So you have, for example, the war in Ukraine. In the last 2 months, countries have been scrambling for food, for fertilizers, for minerals, and these combinations of geopolitics plus the general drive to transition metals is what drives demand. Now, if you look at the supply side, it's a very interesting map of the world. For you to build an electric vehicle, you need to move through 5 or 6 steps. First, you extract the minerals. Second, you refine the minerals. And then you build a precursor, and then you do a cathode, you build a battery cell, you install it in a car, and then you sell it. In the future, there will be an additional step, which is recycling of that battery, but we're not there yet. China has 70% of steps 2 to 6 in the world. Africa has step 1, which is extracting the minerals, exporting them to China. Now, the gap that is very interesting, which we as AFC think we can fill, is how to localize at least the first 3 steps, which is from extracting the mineral up to the precursor or the cathode. We have done studies on that, and we have made a strategic decision, to use the metals because most of the battery metals are in Africa in abundance, whether it's lithium, cobalt, or copper, and build a precursor plant. Now, the interesting thing is that on the supply side, Europe and the US does not have these steps. They only do the battery cells at the end. So there is a gap that is very clear. We are in a very strong position because we have the minerals. We don't need to send them all the way to China and then import them back. So,
are there specific industries that you've identified?
So mining, obviously, but also taking it a step forward to go all the way to refining of the minerals and then building a precursor factory.
Thank you. And that was some interesting insights there. And what I find particularly interesting is this notion of taking a bigger chunk of the value chain, really, if I may say it this way. And that brings me to you, Mr. Paulo. So you have experience both in the private and the public sector, as well as in climate financing. Now, when we think global value chains and integrating global value chains from the perspective of African industries, how can we do so in a way to not only integrate global value chains, but do so in a greener manner?
Yes, I think there was some very good discussion this morning about the issue of climate change and climate finance. I think my countryman Carlos was talking about the importance of negotiation. But it's also the importance of being extremely proactive strategically. And I think the white paper that was produced by AFC was a very important tool to go to Cairo. That's very important. I was involved in setting the green climate change. And the promise at that time, when the thing was structured, I was in the board for a few years, and I resigned at some point because I was very disappointed, was that there was an agreement that money will be provided for climate finance in a much more dynamic way. So I want just people to be, to manage expectation about the issue of the finance for climate change. But to go back to what you're saying in terms of the value chain and others, there again, we shouldn't let it to the market. There will be a need for us and institutions such as AFC to be a market maker. You need to create companies that will do that. I followed the experience of Gagan because I was involved at that time together on doing the strategy on Gabon. There was a huge opposition to do the processing of the woods in when Gagan created the GOC Special Economic Zone. There was this very strong resistance, but it was a greenfield initiative. So I think it's important for us to send the signal here that many of these things that we will need to change in the value chain will have to happen through creating new companies, greenfield company. This is not a business for private equity. This is about assembling resources and partners and manager like they did in Gabon and create that. So I think it's very important that narrative to be put into place, because when you go to address the issue of the value chain and the logistic that you need, you will need to set up companies, and those companies that need to be ring fenced, like the one in Gabon, those are kind of a special economic zone with all the ecosystem, but you have to also address also the need in terms of the corridors. So I will just insist on the fact that in the next few years, in order to implement the CFTA and to deal with the value chain, we need to create companies that will deal with this issue of value chain, bring the operators, and one concrete aspect company that need to be put in place in everything around shipping and trucking the goods, and also managing the borders, because we have signed the CFTA, but there's still huge problem at borders, and people cannot get from Togo to Benin properly, for Ghana to Lome properly, and there's a need to manage those cross-border things physically.
Absolutely.
So it's all those, the chain of issues, but has to be solved but through companies that need to be put in place in order to manage that challenges.
Yeah, absolutely, no doubt about that. And I'd actually like to get to hear a little bit more about some of the challenges that you came across. But before we get to that, I'd like to bring Mr. Kola into the conversation. So looking at, even just hearing what we've heard now, ultimately we have a best scenario case study that ended up in the way that we would desire. And so, Mr. Kola, how do you see the importance of national champions in, as Mr. Paulo has just said, in creating new companies, creating greenfield companies, and having those examples? How important is it?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I think Nigeria has a different positioning when it comes to creating value chains and ecosystems. One, because we've got a very mature oil and gas industry that's been on for over 60 years. And the Nigerian government's push of the local content policy has been a big driver of that. So over the last 20 years, more so the last 10, you now see what we call local oil companies who are becoming champions. And in this, they're creating a value chain proposition where you're seeing value add industries being created onshore Nigeria. And that's where you see champions like us come. This opportunities only started from 2007 to 2011. The government made a push to the international oil companies. If you're not producing these assets, government needs revenue, because government makes money only from production, not from reserves in the ground. If you look at the balance sheets of the global oil companies, they actually get value in reserves statements on their balance sheet. But the host countries only earn revenue, get taxes from production. So when government realized this, they made sure that most of these assets will be sold, and in so doing, the local content policy kicked in. And that created the little giants you see in African oil and gas today. And in so doing, it dovetailed into logistics suppliers, pipe coating suppliers, who are all now local companies. You have drillers who are now local companies. And that's an ecosystem, if maintained in industries like cocoa. If you listen to what Mr. President from Ghana said today, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, you're talking over 75% of global cocoa production. Yet the value add on the continent is 7%. So imagine if that transformation, you insist on the continent that this must be done. You see job creation and a lot of value creation in that chain locally. And that's a changing dial for the continent.
Absolutely. And to go back to you, what were some of the challenges that you came across?
I'll share the challenges that we are facing currently. So a good example, we are now looking to do cashew transformation in Benin. So Benin does about 200,000 tons of cashew. Yes, and we are looking to do the same in Ivory Coast. So when we wanted to order machines in Vietnam, the Cashew Association told us, the government has unofficially told them not to export any machines for transformation to Africa. So that's the real challenge we are facing today. So if you want to actually go and place orders for cashew transfer machine in Vietnam, they will not be able to supply you. They will find some excuse or the other. So we went a little bit step ahead, and we actually got now somebody to come and establish a factory for manufacturing machines for cashew transformation in Benin. So I think what Paulo was saying is sometimes you have to break a little bit of the tradition and do very differently. So I think first challenge is really ensuring how do you, some of these challenges that you have not anticipated, they will come. And if you prepare to sort them out. So there's no one particular challenge, but some of these things. The second thing I think is really on human capital formation. So how do you get people trained? Because if you want to do garmenting, so we are setting up 3 textile mills in Benin, and they'll be operational next year. But how do you get people trained in garmenting and all those aspects? So how do you get people trained? That's the second aspect that we face, challenge. I think the third aspect typically is how do you get competitive resources. So typically how do you ensure that you get power at right cost or other inputs at the right cost. So really addressing the power and other key inputs at the right cost. So for example, to the point you're asking, all our industrial zones are now powered by clean energy. And we're actually ensuring that all the industrial zones have their own life cycle carbon assessments. So we can actually tell you, if you process a cashew in Benin, produce in Benin, and ship it to France, what is the carbon positive impact versus taking it to say Vietnam or China. So I think the African industrialization will actually be very climate friendly globally because you'll transform the resource next to where it is produced.
So that really points out the importance of local value creation and ecosystems, developing our own ecosystems, our own machinery, and working together. And Mr. Abubakar, I'd like to ask you about the importance of infrastructures in unleashing the potential of industrial parks. I mean, you've worked on the Djibouti ports, the collaboration with Ethiopia, the 3-zone authority. How do you see this in terms of wealth creation for the country?
I was also working in Nigeria, Tinkan Island, as MD.
Sorry, pardon?
I was working as MD in Tinkan Island port.
Ah, okay, my airport.
In Nigeria. So I'm almost Nigerian. So we have to see the big picture. In terms of value chain, without infrastructure, it's not going to work. I know who of you have heard about the ship size called Handymax, Afromax is the biggest shipper can call African port. Afromax, Panamax, Swissmax. So Canal of Panama and Suez Canal, they have upgraded the deep sea. So what we need is we have to cross the continent, east to west, west to east, from Indian Ocean to Atlantic. We cannot talk about value chain without crossing the continent. Africa continent is the only continent to transport cargo from the east to the west and vice versa. You have to go around the continent. Cape of Good Hope or the Suez Canal, Mediterranean Sea, Gibraltar, and then down to Nigeria. We need, and Ismail is here, is a 70 billion to cross the continent. But we can pay back in 7 years. The other thing is energy. Deep sea ports we are doing in the West. You know, out of 45 countries landlocked in the world, 17 is located in Africa. In the East, we have long sea coast. We have only 9 countries: Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa. You have 21 countries with sea coast because they conquered you before us, because the Suez Canal was not open that time. So, first, the seaborne trade in the world is representing 80% of the commerce of the world. We are developing deep sea ports, and then what we need is to connect along with Nigeria, Ethiopia, DRC Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya, and also Uganda. 800 million population, consumers to be connected. Let's cross the continent. That's my message.
Some interesting points there throughout the discussion, actually. And Mr. Same, when you look at the success that is Arise, the success of the Djibouti ports, the free zones, is the risk premium justified in terms of the cost of raising capital on the continent?
The short answer is no, but the longer answer is, if you look at the project on a standalone basis, the risk is high. If you look at a project and think, how will you transform the product? How will you move it to the nearest port, and how will you export it to realize value? Then the risk significantly goes down. And this is exactly what we do at AFC. We are not a financial institution. We are solution providers. So we look at the project, we see how can we help that project develop, get more value? How can we connect it, whether it's roads, rail, etc., special economic zones to add more value to capture part or all of the supply chain, and then the ports. So if you look at each of these pieces alone, it could be a risky project. But if you look at the whole chain, you immediately reduce the risk of the project. There is also the perception, I mean, I'm going to give you 2 examples. The difference between the perception of risk and the real risk, I call it the Google effect. I come from Egypt. If you Google Egypt today, you will see that there was a terrorist attack 2 days ago that killed 11 security forces. If you don't know, if you're an investor, and if you don't know Egypt